Space. It's beautiful for you to be part of T-Space lecture series. I will do a very brief introduction, give everybody some time to get a cup of coffee and then settle in, and then I will pass it on to you, Chris, okay?
Okay.
So welcome again to our residents and to our broader audience. Thank you for joining today. This is the first in a series of 8 public lectures. They are organized by T-Space within the framework of the Architecture Residency program. I am Irini Tsakhreli. I'm a practicing architect and an educator, and I've been involved with T-Space since 2017. I'm now serving as the director of the educational programming, and I've been instructing for the residency program along with Stephen Hall since then. We have been running this program along with a beautiful group of people, including Madeleine Hamilton, who is our residency host, and we will hear from her briefly as well. For our new audience, T-Space is a non-profit organization. It's an initiative of the Stephen Myron Hall Foundation, and its programming is curated in a way that supports art, architecture, music, poetry coming together. And the residency is one part of that programming, but there is additional exhibits and poetry readings and music events taking place at T-Space in upstate Rhinebeck, New York. And currently there is a beautiful show on display by Peter Haley in collaboration with Steph Gonzalez-Turner at T-Space. We can share in the chat some links and the website and other information for people who are interested to take a look. And followed by another show by James Kasseber. And these are also people who will be lecturing in this series. And so I'm very much looking forward to that. We will talk about that a little bit later. And so this lecture, along with others that we have scheduled for this year, is part of the residency program, and we see here our residents are on the panel. The program is a 25-day intensive, which is now in its 8th year, and the residents are young professionals and students in the field of art and architecture, and their design thinking and approach is now under the umbrella of the theme correlations for this year. So we will hear a little bit more and talk. I hope we have a chance to talk a little bit more with Chris and the residents today about the theme correlations. So I just wanted to say briefly hi to Nare and Emily and Christina and Guanming and Mason. It's wonderful to have you on the program. A very brief note on our wonderful supporters who have made this scholarships possible and this lecture series possible. I just want to add a note that the program is free of any cost for the residents, and in addition to that, there is a small travel stipend that we have the ability to offer, so the residents can come and visit here in Rhinebeck. And so that's only possible because of the generous support of different individuals and foundations, and that includes the Steve Pulimud in memory of Jenny Crane, the Al Health Foundation, the Robert Silman Associates, with additional support for this program provided by Ellis and Jeff and Jeffrey Brown. Thank you so much for your support. Blythe and Tom, Alison Main, Ashley Morgan, and Stan Allen. So I will close here and pass it on to Maddie, who can explain briefly the structure of this webinar before we hear from our guest speaker, Chris, today. Thank you.
Thank you, Irini. So we will hear from Chris Bardt for about 35 to 40 minutes of presentation, and that'll be followed by about 15 minutes of Q&A from our panelists and also from the broader audience. Feel free to use the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen as well as the chat to submit questions or for our lecturer or just questions in general, and check out the chat for other relevant information and links. Please ask questions throughout the lecture. You don't have to wait until the end. Welcome, and I will pass it on to Emily, one of our residents, to introduce our speaker.
Hi, everyone. My name is Emily, and it's my pleasure to introduce Christopher Bardt, architect, theorist, artist, writer, and educator, to the first of T-Space Orion Beck's Architecture Lecture Series. Christopher Bardt is a co-founding partner of 360 Architecture with Hina Lesky. Aptly named to evoke the completeness of her circle, Chris' practice draws geometry, perception, poetry, and pragmatism into cohesion, with projects ranging from furniture to the urban landscape. Recognized for his long and dedicated commitment to impactful design work, Chris was awarded the Lifetime Achievement Award by the Rhode Island Design Hall of Fame. As a theorist, Chris focused an in-depth research into the interaction of the conscious mind and the material world, was crystallized in his book, Material and Mind, published in 2019 by the MIT Press, in which he emphasizes on the engagement with material to be an essential part of the creative process to inspire immaterial thoughts like ideas, feelings, and intuitions. For more than 25 years, Chris has been an esteemed educator at Rhode Island School of Design, where he nurtured countless students, including myself, with an influential pedagogy, inspiring students to develop an artistic design process, combining poetic sensibilities and sensuous reasoning. We're honored to have him kick off the T-Space Architecture Residency Lecture Series. Please join me in extending a warm welcome to Chris for his lecture titled The Feeling of Space.
Oh, thank you, Emily, for the kind words. Erini and Madeline, thank you for hosting me. It's summer, so hopefully the mood can be a little bit more relaxed, because that's a special time of year for hopefully all of us. Today I want to talk about space, and this is my first time giving this lecture, which is in a way a summation of a book that's forthcoming in a couple of months called The Feeling of Space. And so I may cut the lecture off, or I may cut out some parts because it may be too much stuff to cover, but we'll see. We'll see how it goes for about 40 minutes. And then we'll have some Q&A, I suppose. So the subject of space is kind of ridiculously large. Space is everywhere. Space is reality. But so I want to use the talk to perhaps give you some tools to reconsider how we conceive and think and discuss and work with space. Now, not everyone is an architect in the world, but those of us who are in a way the custodians of space. Certainly the built environment is a manipulation of space, and we should be the ones who are expert. But oddly enough, it's one of the strange realities in our field is that we don't particularly have a very good grasp of the relationships between how we think of space and how we think of architecture, or how we think of the world. So let me just jump into this and give you, hopefully in the next 35 minutes, an overview of what I'm trying to get at. So the previous book, Material and Mind, had broached the subject, which is well understood in cognitive science and less understood in the arts and design. And that is that the mind itself is not a brain encapsulated thing, but that it's at least extended, probably more than that, probably something that I would argue is what you use the word enacted by its environment. In other words, we're really a half a mind. The other half is out there. We close the circuit as we live. And so what that implies is the implications are enormous, because it implies that everything out there, everything we design, everything we manipulate out there is in fact part of defining who we are, what we are doing, what we are thinking, how we are imagining. So if we consider that as a kind of jumping off point, I want to focus on space as perhaps it's best known, in that in a way, space has become a strange binary. The idea of space, on the one hand, is one that is understood as something neutral, homogeneous, isotropic, isomorphic. In other words, space is is almost a mathematical construct. And certainly it goes back to Newton and Descartes, whose ideas we live in right now, today. Our field of design, planning, geopolitics is driven by this idea that space is a neutral, homogeneous entity that simply is extensive, and that within space, anything that can be measured is taken up, and anything that is not measurable is simply not, is ignored. And we have, in a way, a leftover idea of space, which we might call place, in which we would say our emotions might reside. We might say that the feeling of a place, the mood of a room or of a setting, is something that we are all, in a way, share as a kind of, to say, common language and a common sensibility about place. And I would say that's a destructive binary. And I want to, so the talk here is to go through this with this idea in mind, that space as a purely neutral mathematical condition is, by being in opposition to place as something that is felt and experienced, has created a kind of destructive condition in the world. And that my advocacy is to start to bring those back together. And so let me go through some images so that we can, in a way, grasp things more tangibly. And this is one of the difficulties of space, is because every time you talk about space, you go, and where, what, it's very hard to talk about. So let me try with these images to take us on a little trip to perhaps illustrate what I'm getting at. So I'm going to do a share screen here, and I'm going to have to do a little trick with the shared screen. Let me just go back into here. There we go. So first I'm going to do this, and then I'm going to do play from start. Everyone see that? The feeling of space?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, and then I'm going to do a little trick on my end, which is to, so you're still seeing the title, right?
No, we're looking at the presenter's mode now.
Okay, so now I go into another share and I go back to this and I do that, and
there you go. Excellent, yes.
Okay, so for those of you who are old enough, I guess, this is something that came out, I don't know, in the 70s, and it's still iconic even today. This quite funny cover of the New Yorker showing the New Yorker's view of the world. And it was funny because, there you see New York, and all of a sudden the rest of the world just sort of fades away. And I'm just showing it because the humor is based on an assumption that reality is isotropic and isomorphic and mathematically determinate. And this is such a strong understanding. It's very difficult to sort of poke at it and to reveal that it's quite an absolute understanding for so much of what we do. So, the long history of projection, of mapping, of turning the world from a kind of a mystery into something that is a pure commodity, that's been an ongoing project for thousands of years. And certainly you could say, as architects, we are completely immersed in the idea of space as being a neutral mathematical entity, literally by the tools we use. So if you use any tool, it's always going to be reliant on that presupposition. Let me try this. Okay, so we look at these archaic machines, but this is something that is quite deeply embedded in our consciousness, the idea of a mechanical reality. So planetary motion, this is a fantastic machine that was developed in a way demonstrating all the complexities of planetary movement, but it's a complexity that can be explained through a kind of not just a metaphor of a machine, but literally as a machine. And that's, you could say, the evidence of that is everywhere. Of course, we've got to the moon through this kind of thinking. We've done incredible things through this kind of thinking. So we're simply reinforcing that this is the condition of space, because how can it be otherwise? But when we look at some little image, this is just a little example. When we look at a little image and I ask you, what are we looking at? You could say, well, we're looking at some circles, and maybe there's things that are further away and some things are closer. And well, maybe they're portals. Who knows? In other words, the ambiguities of space, if you allow yourself to spend a minute, start to come forward. We don't know how flat this is. We don't know how deep it is. We don't know how far, how close. We don't know how big things are. And so we start to, in a way, navigate about realizing that space is something that perhaps isn't so set and neutral. So, and lo and behold, Einstein famously said, look, all of thinking about space comes down to two fundamental models. And I should make a side note that, this is, you could say, a Western-oriented discussion about space, but it is also one that is oriented towards, you could say, a common understanding that is now global. There is very little disagreement about what space is. This is the thing that's quite startling. So the one model of space, which is perhaps the one that is both archaic but closer to us who think about architecture as something that is, in a way, negotiating relationships between things that otherwise would not have relationships. So model number one, space is defined by things. So space is literally the interval between things. If you don't have things, you don't have space. That's in that model. So in that model, the space and the things are bound to each other. They're contingent on each other. They form each other. And in the second model, space is absolute. And this is the breakthrough, so to speak, of Newton and Descartes. The space is of the highest order. There's nothing beyond space. And things in space have no effect on space whatsoever. Space is unaffected by things in space. Now, things may be affected by space because things have gravitational attraction and all that kind of thing, but space itself is unaffected. This is the Newtonian model. And this is the one that we've come to believe, I think, and live in, dwell in as so-called reality. So when you go, I don't know, when you go, and look at real estate in New York, and a real estate agent says it's 1,000 square feet, you figure, either they're cheating or it feels small just because something else is going on, but you still believe it's 1,000 square feet. So, so those two models, I would say, sit on one side as the fundamental models, and there is an other idea that started with Plato, and it's an idea that comes and goes and has many manifestations. And when I speak about it a little bit, you'll go, oh yeah, I think I understand that. And there are could say other cultures which speak in this similar fashion about something which is a space that is where space and place are fused. They are one and the same. And so Plato used the term chora, which had referred to a kind of region. But he then brought the idea of chora into a philosophical discussion about space. And so in Plato's mind, that the idea of the Platonic, the ideal, the conceptually ideal, the eidos of things, versus the sensible, the becoming, the unformed, was not a complete enough, that binary was not a complete enough model of reality. So he proposed chora as a kind of receptacle. And so this goes back to the idea of region, but the chora was a receptacle in his explanation. And the receptacle could receive both the sensible, the felt, and the eidos, the conceptual. And in that receptacle, something could be formed that would be perhaps understood. And he likened this to neither space nor material, not stable nor determinate. It was both matter and space, but to understand it, it wasn't through logic or it wasn't through sensibility, but it was through what he called bastard reasoning. That's a loose translation of that term. So a kind of, let's say, poetic reasoning. That was the only way to understand the quadratic condition of space-place. And so I think it's important as an idea because I think it resonates, and then perhaps at the end of the lecture, it will make a little bit more sense. The image here I'm showing is a painting of the famous Plato dialogue of Phaedrus, which is set in a kind of landscape. It's the only dialogue of Plato's that's set in a landscape. But the point of the dialogue and the discussion starts to become infiltrated by the surrounding trees, by the surrounding cicadas. And so the conversation is in a way warped by the setting. And that's the idea of Cora literally being demonstrated in a dialogue. So when we look at things, we can start to understand that language has a role to play in how space is understood. So when you look at the image on the left, you say, oh, those are spheres in space. That's fine. When you look at the image on the right, which is exactly the same image, it's just reversed and the shading is taken off. That's the space. The black part is the space between those things, but it's hard to say what it is. There's no name that you want to give to it or will give to it. So you look back on the left, and you start to realize the spheres dominate because we can name them. The space is something that falls away. So it's a harder thing to grasp because of language has a way of identifying reality for us. If we can't name it, it doesn't exist. So the consequence of treating space as this kind of neutral, homogeneous, where no material condition affects it, are serious. They're very, very powerful. So you look at the Boston freeway, which is, some people say the largest infrastructure mistake in the United States history, because it was $12 billion to undo it. This is the highway being built in Boston, not the highway being taken down. So this is the big dig in the 50s, long before it was the big dig, when it was the freeway, which is going to blast through the city. And the engineers said, it's not a problem, we'll just raise it because space simply continues underneath and the neutral condition of the world continues. So how can this be a bad idea? So this is not just since Newton and Descartes that we've been thinking of space as something that's neutral and mathematical and homogeneous. That technology, since many thousands of years, has always, and I would say not perhaps always is a strong term, but has a tendency to develop within a boundary. So the idea of the framework has been a very powerful idea for technologies to develop. So whether it's weaving, which is literally a framework on which operations are articulated in a logical sequence, warp and weft, the shuttle, and all that. Agriculture, which not dissimilar from weaving, right, which was about a kind of tilling of a very, very set field and controlling what happened inside it. In other words, it's basically domestication of nature within a bounded area. Writing, same thing, in that writing, once the tablet was established as the field of operation, and writing, like agriculture, started to work through a logic that was sequential and had a logic of how it unfolded. And then I show that little image there of the farmer and his cow or steer farming, because not coincidentally there was a form of writing which fell out of favor called Busfordurian writing, which was writing that followed the path of the tilling of a field. So you would read from left to right down, and then right to left down, and then left to right, just like the tilling of a field. And of course, on the lower left, the enterprise of building itself is an enterprise that is devoted to the idea of creating a bound and creating a logic within that bound. So you can start to see that space, the control of space, is implicated in the development of technologies. And that's, whether we're talking about the latest AI chip, it's still the same thing, which is that there is a bounded area in which a highly controlled sequence of activities are done. And this is true with almost all technologies. So the idea of order and space emerges from those proto-technologies. The idea of how does the world, exist within the larger universe. This was a question of concern of the ancients that started to bring the same idea of boundedness as a way of understanding reality. That space would be something that is bounded. By bounding space, you would still it, you would control it, you could order it, you could understand it, you could make the world comprehensible and habitable, right? So in the middle, you see a Babylonian tablet with field measure. And field measuring happened first as a kind of ad hoc activity out in the field, and then it became a classroom exercise in geometry, and then it was brought back out in the field. So geometry was in a way emerged literally from agricultural practices of bounding properties, trying to understand how to measure them, and then extending that measurement into a concept, and then bringing that concept back to the field. So you can start to see how space is starting to become, in a way, mathematical. And same with even the idea of the temple, right? That the temple was a bounded space, cut off from the perimeter in order for the divine to make its appearance. It's the same with cities. These cities are 8,000 years apart. On the left is one of the ancient neighborhoods of Ur. On the right, the leftover bombed out remains of Chemnitz city in East Germany after a bombing in World War II. But they're remarkably similar in that the idea of the city as a kind of ceaseless reordering, rearranging, redefinition of space that's always abounded, right? It's something that's not a new invention. It's not something that is particularly evolving. It's something that happens over and over and over again, reinforcing the idea of space as something that is controlled. So literally the structure of thought, knowledge and space start to coincide. And I don't think we can escape a kind of a sense that how we started to order ideas, how we started to order knowledge as knowledge accumulated, and how we thought of space can't be separated from St. Jerome and his cabinet. The idea of similar to the cosmology of Aristotle, the idea of nested enclosures, to the Wunderkammers, where artifacts were collected from around the world. These are the predecessors to museums. The idea of the interior condition started to open up a new way of understanding the world, that you could bound a space, find yourself in a position of turning that interior, like technology, into a kind of a complete world that was in a way cut off from the rest of the world, but in a way was a representation of the rest of the world. So the organization of these, so we say, interior conditions and the organization of knowledge and artifacts, they went hand in hand. It's a symbiotic condition. No, one did not follow the other. They happened at the same time. So in a way, a culminating building, which was quite literal, right, which is the Bibliothèque Sainte-Geneviève by Labrouste, is in a way a structuring of knowledge, right? That architectural space and the organization of knowledge are one and the same. Right? The building is literally a model of knowledge. And one thing I want to point out in the building is that Labrouste was very careful in his layout to make it seem as if it could be any dimension. In other words, knowledge is not limited. So even though, of course, the building is an enclosure, the building is just a number of bays. It's like a warehouse. And that the tables, even though they were designed this way, they've been changed, but the tables were laid out also in the same way that the building could simply be expanded as knowledge expanded. So it's an example of space and knowledge now being in a kind of, I would say, in a relationship which we're not even aware of until that relationship is broken. That the relationship is so symbiotic, we are in a way unaware of the spatial implications of how knowledge is organized and the implications of how knowledge is organized on space. Next sort of 5 slides are about distortion. It's an odd word to use, but I want to use the term distortion to talk about space and how there was a strong awareness that space was not a normal or homogeneous or neutral condition, and that the role of architecture was to interact with the spatiality of the world and to harmonize with it. So for centuries, right, the job of the architect was to create harmony, harmonic proportions, harmonic relations, in order to make things start to feel they were in sync with the rest of the world. So you had to manipulate elements in order to make them attuned to the spatial context that they were in. So there was an awareness of the, say, early architects of the, we say, the subjectivity of space. Even the Greeks, of course, famously were super aware of the optical distortions that were necessary in order to make things appear, correct, right? These are the two things, the entices and then the swell of the plinth of temples, right? That is now well documented distortion that was used in order to clarify the relationship of these, I would say, temples with the spatial context. So it required, so space was not neutral. Space was something that had to be engaged with in order to be, in a way, related to. So it keeps going. In the Baroque, these are 2 images on the left from Carmiel, who used distortion quite explicitly as a way of making a relationship between the human condition and the divine, and that architecture in his mind needed to be a distorted condition that you would get a privilege moment where you could see the divine. So this was in the middle, his proposal for St. Peter's, and that you would stand in the middle and you would see a perfect circle, but that you would be in the middle of a distorted ellipse. But even this is a contemporary condition that we're well aware of, the anamorphic. This is a kind of a double play with the Dutch photographer Jan Dibbets, where there's an anamorphic square he taped on the wall. He made a photograph that was quite a famous photograph. But this is a photograph of that photograph on it as a distortion. So I'm just showing it to, in a way, remind ourselves that space gets quite rich and complex when you start to understand that there are many, many layers of say, spatial conditions present in something like that photograph. And keeps going, you know, the Baroque, of course, was a kind of culmination of these distortions in order to evoke something greater than what was being looked at. But even today, relatively speaking, I mean, this is from the 70s. This is Gordon Matta Clark. The idea of building as a stable spatial condition is very, very strong. In other words, that's one of the you could say presets of architecture and building, is that architecture and building are incredibly stable conditions, stable enterprises. And the reason why Gordon Matta Clark's house, just a simple cut, was shocking is because the stability of the house. We don't know a house other than as something that is a stable structure. So when he cut it open, right, it was a shock, right, to see that light coming through, to see the building doing what it does. It's a shock because it's a symbolic condition that is shocking, not so much an operation. Okay, so some structure got tilted slightly. It's a shock because the symbol of the stable structure is now turned on its head. And he did it, of course, in Paris. So I shouldn't say, of course, he did it in Paris as well. And these are two images of the very, very same thing, just to remind ourselves that when spatial conditions depart from the norms, from what we are used to, they can be quite amazing. Like this is a cone cut into a building, an old Parisian residential building that was slated for destruction for the Beaubourg that was coming. And so he literally carved the cone obliquely into the building. And these are the floors and walls of the building intersecting the cone to make something that is, in a way, a kind of a shock, again, symbolically, because this is not normal. This is not how space should be. So start to realize that space, in a way, we hold space conceptually in a certain way, and that our holding of space in that way leads to how we view our activities in the world as architects and designers. Rachel White-Reed's house was also a shock to the community. It had to be taken down before it was supposed to, because there was so much uproar over this house. You might wonder, like, why would someone get upset? It just was upsetting to people to see this house. And this is, of course, a cast of a house. So the space of the house is now solidified. And you can see the fireplaces, you can see the windows now as solids and voids exchanged. So seeing space exchange itself with a solid to evoke that reaction. And I think it gives us another clue about, again, how strongly the Newtonian and Cartesian idea of neutral space has, in a way, infused us with our thinking of the world. This is the last piece on distortion. This is a little, very small distortion, almost not noticeable. This is Pleshnik's project for the Prague Castle, one of several that he did there. And this is the presidential, this is the waiting room to meet the president of the country. And what he did here is one very strange thing, and I had the good fortune to be able to experience it. So he lowered the floor by 2 inches. And so you walk into this foyer, and it's a waiting place, and the floor is 2 inches lower. And it is such a minor thing. There's it's a very, very unsettling thing. You know right away that that you're down, okay? That you're down and waiting for the president. It's very, very powerful. It just shows us how space is symbolically loaded. One more thing about distortion. So some of you may know Fred Sandback, and he worked with, I would say, an illusion, but that shows us that how much our mind grasps space conceptually and wants to grasp it conceptually. That we look at that that red piece on the floor, and you see something like a red outline 2x4, and you see those cubes, so to speak, on the right. Those are things you see, but that's not what they are. But we want to see that, and our mind, our apparatus of our mind, wants to see the geometric figure. That's what, because it dominates our perceptual apparatus in terms of space. So, I mean, just to give it away, these are made. The one on the left is made with red thread. Except, and of course, how is that possible? Well, there's 4 steel pegs that are deeply embedded in the concrete, and they are the same thickness as the thread, and they are painted red, so you can't tell. But so the verticals are pegs; they're not red thread. Even though you know that now, you still look at that piece and you see a volume. I have about 10 minutes, so I think maybe we'll get through. We'll see. So space is also socially constructed. I'm kind of giving you bits and pieces, but I think these are the big chunks, right? Social space. It's been argued there are twin urges that underpin the social dimension of space, and one of the urges is to be connected to others, and the other is to be independent, to in a way find your own, in a way define your own independence. And they're contradictory urges, like magnets. We're both needing to be away, but also needing to be connected. And so it's a little bit like a magnetic field. And there's this is a day in Central Park, and you can see how typical, like the beach, people they want to be as far away from each other as they can, but they also want to be, together. So there's one example that I know of. I don't think there are others, which is a place called the Cells, or Kelia, which was a very strange settlement that started with celibate monks going into the desert. This is in pre-medieval times, going to the desert to live a solitary life of just prayer and nothing else. So this idea of going to the desert to be alone, to be absolutely in an environment which there was no one else around, it caught on. So what you're looking at on the right are individual cells. So each of them is a little walled-in compound, and there's a little tiny enclosure for a bed. And these are all monks out in the desert, and there's 5,000 of these cells that were built out there, all independent and all proximate to each other. And the strangest thing happened, which is that this will to independence started to change, and this was over 500 years, started to change, and eventually these cells became the individual cells became sort of double cells and then quadruple cells, just like literally biological cell matter. And finally, at the sort of apex moment, this is what you can see. These are the remnants in the desert, is that these cells became monasteries. In other words, monasteries have the echo of this solitary, singular life, the monastic cell, but now they've collected themselves in a larger social order. And so you see here the astonishing proposition here of these, what started out as individual cells to a collection of monasteries, many. I mean, we see about 6 or 7 in this one image, and that becoming the predecessor to the sort of the monastic model of architecture. So that was one example of just how social space is something that is incredibly important for us as architects, of course, but it also is the, you could say the key to understanding how society starts to govern and regulate and hold itself together, cohere. This is Lazaretto Vecchio in Venice, and infamous or famous for being really the first quarantine station for Venice. So until then, and this is probably the best evidence we have, that the way that people lived in, say, certainly in the medieval period, but there's also lots of evidence that this goes back to the Romans, to the Greeks. People lived in a much more cohering way, that there was less differentiation between what your station in life was and where you lived. It was much more mixed up. And so from the archaeological digs, Lazaretto Vecchio shows evidence of that rather than the quarantine being, the poor people go here, the rich people go there, the evidence is that everybody was quarantined together. There was still strong sense of social coherence spatially. It wasn't until later that these things started to get differentiated. And that the idea of quarantine, though, broached the subject of separation, which plays itself out over the next hundreds of years. That separation as a way of controlling space, a way of controlling society, a way of controlling social orders. And I'll just show a few images of that. But the idea of separation as a valuable strategy certainly started with the question of health, right? That understood that quarantine worked. When you look at the social space, I'm just going quite quickly, you look at the Haussmann's plans for Paris, here the example of Paris brought the idea of contested space forward in a very dramatic way, that we could see through Haussmann's efforts in Paris, right, that there was power, politics, and culture directly acted out as spatial actions. In other words, Paris is a prime example of how space becomes a form of action, becomes what you manipulate in order to achieve political or cultural ends. So Haussmann cutting, you can see on the bottom, cutting avenues through neighborhoods was not just about, cleaning things up, but it was also about using space to assert a certain kind of control dominance hierarchy. And of course, that changed Paris. That completely transformed Paris. Paris became a new kind of place. The experience of walking on the boulevard led to, the whole idea of the flaneur, the observer, the modern citizen who, in a way, was disengaged, was no longer participating with others, but was a kind of autonomous subject that was just looking at things. And that's a very different idea than the community being all in together, getting sick together, having to get quarantined together. Right now, we're talking about a kind of world in which a certain autonomy starts to assert itself. And you look at London, a very kind of similar situation in London, but different as well, because in London, the slums, the overgrowth, you could say, to use a pejorative term that was used in London, they were called the rookeries. these neighborhoods where there was a kind of out of control poverty and out of control living. And what was meant by out of control was that the spatial organization of life was no longer normal or acceptable. People lived on the streets, people lived in alleys. You might have people that were unrelated living on ground floors. People lived in living rooms. People lived in kitchens. In other words, the disorder of life was seen as a symptom of spatial pathology, and that space needed to be used to clean up society. So these poor people needed to be reorganized and put back into place. And so there was plenty of reformers that worked on that, and there were also reformers that advocated for a kind of return to a kind of bucolic and kind medieval paradisical way of bringing community together. And that's on the right that Pugin, in his famous contrasts, was fighting the logic of organizing space with something that you could say the sensibility of a communally gathered space. So that's another whole subject about how the idea of how one manipulates space is seen directly as an idea about how society is organized and how the individual is made part of society. This is something that those of you who have read Robin Evans will be aware of, but the idea of participation or participatory space is something that is important to understand as something that has evolved. So in the Renaissance, for example, there were no corridors that you simply moved from room to room. So everyone understood the kind of that space was something that was shared. That space was your body and another person's body was a question of proximity. It was not a question of segregation. And so with the invention of the corridor, the idea of one class of resident, the owners, and the other class of resident, the help, being separated, came into view, and that became a very, very powerful notion that you could start to organize society based on these powerful new tools like the corridor. And on the far right is just designed for a 19th century school. But by this point, the corridor is less about class, but it's really about how you organize things. I mean, we almost don't think about it, but the corridor is not a requisite requisite device of architecture. It's something that has been chosen in order to separate things out, in order to control the relationships between things. So you could start to see how space and the homogenization of space can start to allow certain ideas to take hold much more strongly than when space is not seen as homogeneous. I'm at 40 minutes, so I have to. So what should I do?
Please continue, Chris.
Okay.
Please continue.
I'm going to go super fast. Okay. So in terms of participatory space, so we get to the modern project. And so for the modern project, the revolution was about space, right? So no longer was space going to be enclosed, but space was going to be continuous. And this was a political idea too, which was that egalitarian, that space would belong to everybody. The privatization of space would be challenged by the idea of continuous space in the public realm. And the devices of spatial ordering, right, became more and more connected to the mechanics. So you can see the Newtonian Cartesian model really taking hold here. So on the left, you see Walter Gropius, a machine-like building, which was an unemployment facility office. And those black lines are all just arrows for people to move through, just like a factory. Or in the this housing project in the Soviet Union, right? The food was brought on conveyors, you sat, right? So it's this idea of taylorization, the idea of the factory was celebrated as the future of the world, that we would all become, in a way, part of a mechanized condition that would become universal. That was the dream. Perhaps Corbusier was one of the few who understood that this dream of movement and mechanization was a dream that had a symbolic dimension, and that was where the value was in architecture, less so than engineering. The idea of universal space, or on the right, the idea of space being everywhere and that it was only a membrane, where they could say the extreme edges of this modern pursuit of universal, you could say, Newtonian space. And the failings of these edges have to do with the participatory aspect. It became very hard to think about how one starts to be in space. And this is a term I use called inscription. In other words, when you can inscribe your life somehow in a spatial order, right, you belong. When you can't, it becomes very, very difficult. And so I'm gonna skip this, but I'm gonna mention this, which is just, you know, as we work with co-working space and everything is relaxed and insouciant, and that you can do what you want where you want in that kind of co-working world. You know, this is the current dream, you could say, of the office. The irony is that on the right here, you see all the trappings are there, including the living wall, but not one person is participating, right? Everyone's on their device. So we have a interesting dilemma in that we are, I think, facing a question of what the relevance is of the spaces that we are, in a way, designing. Henry Lefebvre, who wrote the book, very important book, The Production of Space, noted that homogeneous space fragments experience and heterogeneous space unifies experience. It's something that something worth thinking about, right? So on the left, I would say this is a space that it's very difficult to inscribe with yourself, because the products keep being refilled. You pass, you're irrelevant. On the right, this is the Sharon Berlin Philharmonic. The redundant ways in which you can move and the choices that you're giving start to become incredibly important ways to become, in a way, engaged with space. So that kind of inscription starts to happen, not like a mark, like graffiti, but the fact that you can feel you can move in multiple ways is one of the gifts of that building. I'm going to skip this, okay? But this part is called imagination in space. And so it has to do with how we imagine and how space is part of our imagination. And so when you look at this scene of the empty summer resort, right? You can feel the pathos in it, whether you've been there or not, right? Because there's a kind of indifference to us, right? That it has a kind of life of its own, and that we can participate in it, if we wish to, but it moves on without us. And there's a kind of, I would say, a constant pathos that place always generates. And when I say place, I mean space place. So this part here is about the imagination and the role that space and imagination play with each other. So the one example I want to give, okay. So how language connects imagination and space. So we might look at a scene, and an objective way of describing it is to say a collection of static objects extended into space. This is a Wallace Stevens quote. And then we look at what a poet writes about the very, very same collection of static objects extended into space, right? This city now doth like a garment wear the beauty of the morning, silent, bare, ships, towers, domes, theaters, and temples lie, open unto the fields and to the sky, all bright and glittering in this smokeless air. It's a beautiful poem, and it's a scene on Westminster Bridge in London. But just to clarify, right, that the objectification of space, right, removes all this, right? This is removed when one objectifies space. Another way of imagination of space being related has to do when you look at these incubators for famous companies or organizations. So on the lower left, MIT Building 20, where more Nobel Prizes have been won than at any other place. Michael Dell's dorm room, started Dell Computers, and Hewlett Packard's garage, where they, did all their famous initial work. These are ordinary places. They're incredibly banal. But the key about them is that as spaces, they're not over-inscribed. In other words, they don't prescribe what to do. They were loose enough to be able to offer, you could say, a background for activities to unfold. The MIT Building 20 was a temporary timber building. No one cared about it. People drilled through it and just moved walls around, did whatever they wanted to do. And so there's something that's important to remember about space, is that when space is as a setting, offers the possibilities of being, in a way, imaginatively invented within, it has a special role to play. So I'm gonna skip this. I'm gonna go right to the end. This is just about how representation became I would say, incredibly strong arena for the spatial imagination. Many spatial ideas came out of that, but they failed in a way to successfully be brought into, you could say, 3 dimensions, right? So, for example, the Necker cube, right, is a fascinating thing, but it lives firmly in a 2-dimensional world. But some of these ideas have spilled over into our, you could say, understanding of space and have influenced our understanding of space. So I'm going to quickly go to the last bit here, which has to do with about place. So I'm sort of hoping to bring this full circle. So this is a little chart, and if you haven't heard of it, this is related to this idea of ANT, Actant Network Theory, which is this idea that was developed by a number of social philosophers to remove the human-centric view of social relations, and by doing that, in a way, strengthen our understanding of how everything is a network of relationships. It doesn't have to be a person. In fact, it can just be a thing. It can be an object. It can be an organization. It can be anything. But it's all about the network. And so the irony of this is that it also removes space, right? That this model of reality is one that is where space is simply not a factor. It's only about, it's a relation cloud. So where does that leave us in terms of what role place has as we start to think further and further about how we understand the way we organize the world? And so, one of the consequences of the domination of the Newtonian Cartesian spatial paradigm is the commodification of place, that we've been able to reduce place to something measurable and isotropic and isomorphic. And by doing that, we should not be surprised that what we place down in place tends to be exactly that, isomorphic, homogeneous, and isotropic. So even when we are working with, you could say, the stuff of nature, we are left the question of the will. Are we going to act willfully in our own interest to make the world as a standing ready reserve, which is a term that Heidegger coined, in which he argued that technology, the idea of technology, argues for the world to be nothing other than a standing ready reserve. In other words, it's something that's just a resource. Technology wishes to see the world as a resource. And, this is the image on the left where literally the forest, the trees are being planted purely as a resource. Or are we going to pay increasing attention to the differences, limitations, and heterogeneity of our spatialized reality? And I think that is a kind of existential question that we have to deal with on so many levels. So ultimately, we are bound to place as much as we live in and with our bodies. So place is a body in which we dwell. Place where phenomenon, the sensible and the cerebral, commingle and co-generate reality is really, I would say, closer to the bastard reasoning of Cora than perhaps we imagine. And this just came out, I don't know, a week ago, and this is Donna Tartt in Harper's, the July issue of Harper's, wrote on art, and it ends here. And I just thought, oh, what a perfect ending, in which she makes an argument about art that involves space. Much of art happens and has always happened in the useless space between things. These neglected spaces, cracks in the pavement where the grass sprouts up, are where past and future stand still, where rift and prophecy, and sometimes even flat out miracles emerge. So, with that, I'm going to end it. That is the end. So,
thank you, Chris. That was wonderful. You've definitely given us all a lot to think about. I'm not seeing questions in the chat, so I would love to welcome our panelists to ask some questions. And you can just unmute and go ahead.
I'll go first. Hey, Chris, thank you so much for the incredible lecture. I think it's really kind of summarized how, like, over the times, space is kind of being shaped by different driving forces or being given different configurations. I'm particularly interested in the slide that you showed. On the right side, there's an interior space about from Hesstrom's Berlin Philharmonic, at which I recently visited. I think it's really marvelous buildings. Speak some kind of expressiveness ideas, but I was wondering if offering different kind of alternative paths or circulations within the space is something that can be, let's say, architects' agency against the more and more disciplined technological aspects of our century.
Yeah, I mean that's a tough question because it's grim, right?
Yeah.
In many ways, we are reduced to selection, and that the role of spatial thinking has become under so much pressure that we're simply selecting systems and elements, and we stop thinking. Yeah, and we stop thinking about space. So that's the reason for the book and the lecture. My argument would be, going back to distortion, is that we underestimate how powerful distortion is in architecture. So if we fight, you could say, there's a little bit of room. Like, this is where I love the last line. There's a little bit of room. For example, we're just doing a building now, our firm, and it is turning out to be a perfect example of this, because we have to move, it's an music education center. So the practice rooms have to be sealed acoustically. The performance hall, which is in the center of the building, has 18-inch 3-layer walls, absolutely separate. So you go, oh, they're going to have corridors. And so we have there's no corridor. There's perhaps one area that you might say is corridor-ish for a moment, but only a little bit. And I think that we're lucky. I mean, it just I call it luck. You know, people say, oh, it was design, whatever. But the refusal, to allow the parallel line of the corridor to emerge as a default allowed us to discover a lot of subtle ways in which space could become leaky.
Yeah.
On a symbolic level, it could be leaky on a, like we realize, oh, well, the room has to be enclosed, but it doesn't need to go to the ceiling. Or, the performance hall has to be absolutely acoustically sealed. It doesn't mean you can't have windows in it. They have to be quadruple glazed, but there are things you can do. And so we have elements plunging into the performance hall, but they're sealed. So we have started to discover that architecture, this is what I would say, operates still in a very powerful way on a symbolic level, and that we keep forgetting that because of our technocratic imperative that we're given.
Right.
So I would say that once you make an association with something that in architecture, that this element is like that, is metaphorically like something else, is symbolic like something else, you're empowered. Then you can do things.
Thank you.
I have one question.
Hi.
Yeah, my name is Nare, and thank you very much for the lecture. And I was very interested in the concept of interconnected space. So what I'm curious about is what kind of connections and impacts should such a space have on people, such as poetic moment or feeling of spaces. I feel that's really good and important in the architecture design. But sometimes what is the ultimate goal of a poetic space or the feeling of space?
Well, I'm going to give you an answer, but then at the end I will say, don't trust my answer. I think that this is something that I've come to sort of recently, which is that most of the time you walk into a building and you grasp the whole thing. You don't know the organization of it, but you kind of do. Nothing surprises you. You walk in and you go, I get it. You don't say it to yourself, but you do. And once in a while you encounter something, and whether it's a work of architecture or it's a work of art or it's a piece of music, and you don't get it, but you get enough of it that makes you want to keep going. And I think that I would call that the poetic. That's the poetic, that you're not in a way working with things you know constantly, but you start to allow things you don't know into, you could say, into the working process. And you don't treat them as curiosities or souvenirs, but you treat them as voices that are coming with their own, let's say, authenticity, and they need to help you leave your preconceptions, because we're driven so much by preconception. We think it should be like this. That's why the design process has to be a process, because if it's not, it's simply the execution of preconceptions, strategies, methodologies, and we know where that goes, right? It goes to exactly as we suppose it goes. So I would say the question of mystery perhaps is an important one. That's why I also wanted to disavow it, because we can't just say, oh, okay, I'm going to work with mystery. It doesn't work that way. But I would say to allow the misfit, the problematic, not to be something that has to be managed into conformity, but that allow the misfit to be a key, a guide to changing how you think. That's what a poet does. They allow the subject matter to emerge from the problematics of the words that they're using. They're not trying to write a poem about something.
Yeah, I think that's a very great answer for me. Thank you.
Okay.
Chris, if I may add one more thought, because I'm curious about your thoughts on the theme of correlations for this residency. And you mentioned at some point, obviously, not trying to look at binaries, right? Not as objects relating to each other. You also brought up the ant theory, if I got that correctly, right? The network of agents that surprisingly also remove space out of the equation. So we'll see a lot of interconnections, right? But you argue that space is removed still yet in that model. Can you elaborate a little bit more on that and perhaps tie it back to correlations in some way?
Yeah, that's a great question. So, ANT has spilled into architecture as O. I think SciArc has a philosopher in-house there that is a O. I think coined the term O, object-oriented ontology. The new materialism is the movement in philosophy. I worry because there's something very attractive about the ANT method, because it highlights the relational structures that we are not aware of when we work through a kind of, say, spatialized framework. But my bigger concern is that the whole concept of place, it keeps getting eroded, and I don't mean that we all feel, we're place bound. We're creatures that we cannot live without place. And so I'm not worried about place going away, but I worry about the preciousness or the sense of place as our source going away. And I think ANT removes it as a source. And, we all live somewhere, and, we want to travel, we want to move. Those are legitimate urges. And we might even be unhappy with where we live, or we're unhappy with our situation. It doesn't, that I'm not talking about it. I'm talking about something, the ancient Romans called it genius loci, right? The spirit of place, that somehow it was there, and that we live through the spirit of a place. So, in extreme conditions, you're very aware of it, and you're very aware of how that is guiding you. So if we all decide we're going to move to northern Alaska, well, we know that this would change our lives in a very extreme way. So we would then realize, whoa, our life is bound to this place. So lo and behold, we're urban creatures mostly. We live in a modern, this is what we're doing. We're living in that modern Newtonian world. Neutrality. I can go anywhere. I can be comfortable anywhere. I can be in my car. I can walk down the street. I can do anything anywhere. And we lose, you could say, a sense of feeling for the place we are. That's I think one of the most difficult things to gain, acquire, which is you could say a deep love of where we are, and a deep, in a way, sense of being guided by the place we are, because we are operating in a different model. We're operating in the idea where space is absolute, and it doesn't matter what things are going on in that space is always the same anywhere. Sort of.
Thank you. Beautiful. Yes.
I have some thoughts too. I found really interesting the reference on the supermarket, because at first at the part with the framework and for example the acoustics, where the framework was really clear, and the Haussmann, actually the work of Haussmann, it is really close to the way that actually supermarket was created. it was in the streets, it was a free form in the streets, and then to be controlled, and for the dirt and the social control, everything comes in a box. In the same way the social space came, you said that it was framework. And then it ends up to be the supermarket that is itself today. So for me, it was really interesting to think the history of the supermarket, which comes as a social space, and then it ends up to be in another in another part of the history. It's not social space anymore. So how it changed, I don't know.
Well, I think that's a great observation, right? It's part of our, you could say part of urbanism is walking into a supermarket. It's not disconnected. But of course, like Lefebvre said, the experience feels disconnected because everything's now become homogenous, right? You walk from the car through the parking lot into the supermarket, get back in, go home. You're not thinking anymore. You're just, in a way, almost like a machine. You're almost going through the motions. So what do you do in a supermarket? You behave very narrowly. If someone walked into let's say 5 people walked into the supermarket and then they started to, I don't know, pantomime and make a play, and they were doing some street art. People would get upset. People would be shocked, right? Maybe it would be good, but I have a feeling it would not end that well, right? Because the supermarket is really narrow, incredibly narrow. I mean, I had to wait for 5 minutes because I was looking for some rosemary or something, and they didn't have any. So I had to wait. And it was incredible just because I couldn't move. I had to wait to see what was happening, right? And I would advise everyone, spend 5 minutes not moving in a supermarket. You'll be creeped out. It's a really relentless machine. Everyone does exactly the same thing. And it's always, it's relentless. It doesn't stop, right? So in a way, it's fulfilling the dream, right? I don't know if you know the term tailorization. I used it briefly, but this idea of the optimization of the factory spilled over into the idea of the optimization of society. I mean, Lenin was a huge fan. He thought, this is the best idea the capitalists ever came up with. Let's do it with our society. So this idea of making society a machine was seen as an ideological goal for quite some time. So I think you have a really good observation there.
Chris, there is a follow-up question in the chat from Matthias Neumann. Hello, Matthias. Great that you're here. Matthias is asking a follow-up question on ANT and OO. Could you not argue for specific space to be conceived as a conscious actor within a non-human-centric network? I believe you can see the question too in the chat, Chris, if you want to follow up.
Okay, I haven't looked at the chat questions. Well, I think that I don't know if I can offer anything. I think that if space is Cartesian or Newtonian and isomorphic, isotropic, and neutral, I would say no. But if it's more than that, if it is something that it could say a social construction, then I would say, yeah, that's that. Then you can start to re-enter the conversation. But it's very hard to see how we have to come up with an example, right? A spatial example of how, of how that would tie into the network. So it's something about proximity. I've never seen the network. I mean, obviously, other examples have been given. For example, the rotting of garbage, right? That's where everything has a life of its own, so to speak. That's the triple O thing. And that all those things are interactive, so therefore they operate as life itself. The garbage rots, the trickle of the fluid down, and it pollutes the water, and the fish gets sick, and everything is a chain reaction. We understand that. And of course it all plays out in space, but what does space have to do with it is my question, right? In terms of this narrative, that the non-human narrative. And I would say that maybe this is it's an interesting question. Maybe it points to the idea that space is goes back to the very beginning, to the inactive mind idea, which is that space is half of what we are, is the other half of our mind. And if we think of it that way, and we remove ourselves from it, space is left as a kind of, I'm not sure what it is. But I guess my point that I've been trying to make is that if we recognize space as being the other half of our mind, that the spatialized reality is the other half of our mind, we think we will start to understand space is much richer, deeper, more important than perhaps we've been allowing it to be, by imposing, you could say, a kind of a mathematical, insistent mathematical model on it.
Thank you, says Matthias.
Hi, Chris. Thank you for your lecture. That was a wonderful presentation. I kind of had a question, kind of piggybacking off Irene and Christina. You had a slide that was talking about kind of like this push for more open offices. I think it can even be seen in like houses nowadays too, like this open floor plan scheme. And I was just curious, like, what your perception is on, like, I guess if it is diminishing our everyday interactions with our built environment, or if it is actually enhancing it. So I guess, yeah, part one, like what your perception is on how that is influencing us as a society. And part two is, if it is maybe diminishing, our everyday, how can we go about combating that to maybe bring back that enhancement with how we interact with our environment?
Yeah. These are all such rich subjects. So there is an irony, because as there's you could say the trends towards open living, social conviviality in the home, right? That I'm going to have my kitchen, dining, and living together. This is what people want. They don't want a segregated space, and so it speaks to something. It speaks to sort of the recovery of, you could say, the social body. And in the office world, which is to me fascinating, because it never settles, right? There's no magic, right? It keeps shifting. And so now we're in the open office, we're in the co-working space where you have a meeting, next to the kitchen, or you go to a huddle space. So there's choices, right? So this is now the adventure of choices. And I think there's something right about choices, but when those choices become worn, in other words, you start to become overly familiar with things, those things will fade away. It's like a joke being told too many times. So I would say the power of great design, great architecture, is that it never is inexhaustible. As I would say is true with a great painting too. There's something inexhaustible about it. So it would be about not clicking completely. So there's always some tension, something incomplete, something that requires our having to participate in that space in order to make it work. And it's very subtle. It's very hard to completely understand. I think in our domestic space, we can recognize it more readily. I also noticed that when, like a little architecture firm buys a house, and then all the employees are in the bedrooms and the meeting rooms in the living room, it's kind of creepy. It's like not like they don't really like it. No one likes it. Everyone hates it. So it's interesting to note that, again, we have a preconception about how we dwell. We have habits of dwelling. And I think the role of architecture is to distort those habits. In other words, to in a way, move those habits not to quite fit those habits. And I think that's the hardest thing for an architect to do, because the clients say, make the habitual. And the moment you suggest something, you have to do it in a very artful way in order to get people convinced that this will be valuable. So I would say, yeah, it has to do with incompleteness, has to do with distortion that prevents, you could say, the preconceived habitual dwelling. Oliver Noah, a philosopher, called the idea of the city as frozen habit, which I think, I thought, oh, that's such a great phrase, but also kind of creeps me out a little bit. The city is frozen habit. And because it means two things. The city is a result of habits, but it's also enforcing of habits. You can't get out of your own habits. So it's a problem of the built environment, is that it has to be not over-inscribed. In other words, so prescriptive that we don't even think of choice. And it can't be under-inscribed, which is like universal space, where things are, in a way, lose any kind of coherence. All right. So we have to keep finding that moment of you could say resonance, where it works. And I think that's a hard thing, especially when our tools are literally two-dimensional. They're software, they're models, right? So how do we get to that through those tools? And I would say it starts with feeling a little bit of release from having to do things that are absolutely the way things are supposed to be. Like we're caught in style, we're caught in what the memes of the day, there's no way around it. But the more we can become conscious of having to at least let the memes be the memes and then get through it in order to make discoveries that are, like, again, that are where quirks, have a way of entering into this, say, spatial paradigm, which is about the norms being overly enforced over and over and over again as we continue to build the built environment. So
this is very enlightening, Chris. Thank you so much. And I think it's a great way for the residents to start on their explorations of correlations and to find those moments of resonance like you were just describing. I think this was a beautiful kicking off the residency and the lecture series. I think we can close here with those remarks and questions. And thank you very, very much, Chris, for your time and for the thoughts that you brought into this conversation. We're looking forward to the book coming out.
Yeah. So yeah, the book is coming out December 31st. So yeah.
Looking forward to it, Chris.
Okay.
Thank you so much. We'd love to have you back, and maybe you can comment on the residents' work as well.
Okay. Well, my pleasure to see everyone this morning, and thank you, Irene, for having me, and Madeline for setting this up. Worked really well. Okay.
Beautiful, absolute pleasure. Thank you, Chris. Bye. Bye, everyone. Bye.
Bye. Thanks again.